English translation, 711th Contact, Part 1 Monday the 8th of October 2018, 21:56 hours.
Greetings, Ptaah, my friend. Today I have something unpleasant to report on the one hand, but on the other hand I also have something pleasant to report. The good news is that I have done well to take charge of the treatment of my accident myself. For in the meantime, everything has improved to such an extent that I am only about 5% disabled with my arm, although this may still improve. When I went to the hospital for a checkup, the head doctor told me that if I had undergone the risky operation, if I had survived it at all, but you said that I had not, I would only be able to use my right arm about 50% as I did before the accident. However, it is amazing how extensively I can now move and use my arm and joints without surgery and with so little restriction.
I think he was telling the truth, because that, and what you have achieved without surgery, is an achievement that is not self-evident and testifies to your strength and control over yourself and your willpower, which is extremely impressive to me, and only now makes me understand correctly how you control yourself. But greetings also to you, Edouard, dear friend, to which I must also say for once that it is an extraordinary honor for me to be able to call you my friend.
Excuse me, you are embarrassing me because I guess it is.
No, I know what you are going to say, yet I cannot agree with it.
Okay, then I want to ask you if you were finally able to find out from your experts what is going to happen with the multiple so-called cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin.
Our experts who, at your request, have dealt with the various cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin in terms of clarifying all possibilities, etc., and have also made calculations, etc., for the future existence and value of the cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin, as well as the entire circumstances connected with them, and have investigated everything, have explained the following. Cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin are speculators' machinations, through which those who are caught up in them, followers and believers, are led to believe that they will make great profits in the future, whereby euphemistic self-deceptions corresponding to wishful thinking about a fact that is in reality not very positive are in the foreground, as are deceptions and misconceptions. Looking into the future, our experts have found out that cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin will not last and will not be successful in the long term, but on the contrary will cause a lot of damage. Great losses and financial collapses, and therefore also a lot of distress and misery, as well as suicides for many Earth humans who will lose their financial fortunes through these machinations.
Then I guess the whole thing is nothing but a get-rich-quick illusion of confused crypto and Bitcoin believers.
Your term gets to the heart of the matter.
I found a description on the internet that explains the term Bitcoin in its origin as being composed of the words bit from English binary digit, 0 or 1, and coin. It is written, Wikipedia. The concept of digital currency was described by author Satoshi Nakamoto in a white paper. Nakamoto is not a real person. Rather, the name is either a pseudonym or stands for a group of persons. The so-called cryptocurrency is intended to enable a monetary system that functions independently of states and banks and is cheaper and faster than previous transactions. The digital currency is traded peer-to-peer, that is to say directly between users without the help of banks. This is made possible by the use of blockchain technology. Within the system, all transactions are stored many times and in a decentralized manner.
This does not change the fact that cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin are based on speculators' machinations, which are solely based on wishful thinking and corresponding self-deceptions and on deceptions of third parties or users, respectively, regarding a fact that is in reality not very positive in the foreground.
Good. That should actually suffice as an explanation. Although confused Earthlings will continue to live on in their sick illusions despite your negative prognosis and factual presentation, and will continue with the nonsense and hope for never arriving big profits.
That is indeed the case.
Then that is also cleared up. Consequently, the following arises because of the twin brother of Emmanuel. Precisely, James, are all around sometimes questions, but I do not want to answer them, which is why I do not want to talk about it. At that time, his twinship was deliberately concealed because James objected to being officially associated with the teaching. What do you think I should do, since the story in this regard is not of great importance?
This matter is not of importance, and should therefore also not be discussed in a comprehensive manner.
I suppose the human beings of Earth think it ought to talk about it. But I think that if I were to do so, it would only give rise again to a new faith and new lies and calumnies, etc.
If you were to get involved in this, then more and more questions would arise, as a result of which you would no longer have any peace. So it is certainly better to remain silent and leave what you have just said in the room. What I will say, however, is that I was still thinking about what we talked about the other day regarding the time by the spear thrust at Emmanuel, and I think that this time should be photographed and included in your biography with an explanatory note.
You probably mean because of that after me one or the other impostor could appear and pretend to be my rebirth, perhaps even that of Emmanuel, which would already be harebrained with regard to rebirth anyway, because there is no such thing, but only always a new individual personality, which can never be identical with the former one. Besides, the mark would have to be made artificially, which would then turn out to be an effective scar, but not an innate mark, and would openly reveal the fraud.
That would certainly be the case. For as with regard to many other things, the majority of Earth humans are not accessible to understanding and reason, but only to confused faith in fraud, lies, defamation, and religious sectarian delusion, as a result of which real reality, well-founded knowledge, and the urgent truth can only be perceived contrary to understanding and reason, as everything can neither be considered nor grasped, but misunderstood and therefore not comprehended. This also results from the fact, as I must consistently recognize again and again in my observations of Earth humans, because warnings as well as explanations are effectively not perceived with interest and also not registered, as well as not understood, but as a rule, as a result of a lack of reflection, are only counterinterpreted wrongly.
I can also tell you a thing or two about this, because many Earthlings who react in this manner believe themselves to be cleverer and smarter than the effective reality and its truth, whereby they want to pretend to be intelligent and also clever and smart, and in doing so do not realize how simple-minded and stupid they are, exposing themselves and putting on a show of ridiculousness with all their behavior and actions. But now I would like to address something else which is repeatedly brought up by various people, namely, why you Ptaah have been holding back since time immemorial and have always maintained no direct, but only indirect and thus impulse-based contacts with Earthlings, and will also not maintain any direct contacts today. Nor will you in the future, as you have done since time immemorial with regard to the Earth strangers and the Earth future ones. In this connection, the question also arises again and again why I had to stand as a middleman between the USA and you in order to seek your request to make contact with the US government, which also had to go through Lee Elders. I would also have had to remain your intermediary if contact had been made, because you would only have acted in this manner. Although I know the effective background, in which also the then sphere is integrated, which orbited around all inhabited planets in your Pleiadian system more than 52,000 years ago for 32 days each, after which all human beings became peaceful, I think that you could explain everything about this from your side once, in order to also create clarity in this regard.
You can also explain that, especially in the area of the core group and the passive group, because you know the facts well enough.
I guess I do, but I think it would be good if you do what I just gave my reasoning for.
I think you are setting out to challenge me today. But good. Then I will satisfy your opinion and at least take up the important facts and disclose them. But first I want to tell you what you asked me a long time ago, namely what the Sonora Lake and the dwarf creatures were all about. As you said, I was able to find records about it in my father Svath's annals, which also revealed facts that were completely foreign to me and very interesting. According to his annals, he explored the Earth at many times in the past, and nearly 40,000 years ago he also came across Lake Sonora, where at that time the elevated terrain above the present center was inhabited by small-bodied human beings, who averaged 115 centimeters in height and were the most distant descendants of the first terrestrial hominids. In addition to these small human beings, some of whose most distant descendants are still to be found in Africa as pygmies, as well as in Asia, my father Sfath also researched their origins, which took him to many other areas of the earth, where he came across other various smaller groups of small human beings in Europe, Africa, South and North America, in Australia and Asia. These were all different, however, and ranged up to 160 centimeters in height, were differently pigmented, and also had anatomical differences. Interested, he continued his research into the past of Earth history and Earth humans, and traced the developmental processes of hominids back to the early times of 17 million years. He then went back many more millions of years into the past, and, around 45 million years ago in the area that is now Germany, came across first life forms that developed into a form in early times, from which the hominid evolution emerged around 17 million years ago, and from which, in the course of further millions of years, small-bodied human beings ultimately developed. He discovered these life forms at the place where he was also together with you, in order to teachingly instruct you where the actual original origin of the visible human life form began, in the area that you know as the Messel Pit near Darmstadt. This first development of the life form, which led to the creation of the first hominid species, was found there for the very first time by my father Sfath, from which, over many millions of years, the effective first human being emerged from the descendants that developed from it in what is now known as North Africa, as well as in areas that are now called Europe, South Africa, South and North America, Asia, and Australia. So he established that all the small human beings he researched arose at approximately the same time all over the Earth, and that they were the first and oldest human beings on Earth, completely contrary to the false research results of today's earthly scientific anthropology, whose alleged knowledge is based only on incorrect and hypothetical or made-up assertions. Thus, it has been recognized by research in the past that the very first effective human beings on the Earth were small ones who emerged naturally in various areas from the planet and its nature, fauna and flora itself. So the origin of the Earth humanity was correctly found in Africa, as Earth anthropology teaches correctly, but not in the wise it was thought, because early Earth human history did not begin at the time calculated according to the earliest remains of the genus Homo in Africa, but millions of years much earlier. According to the research of my father Sfath, all findings on Earth concerning the earliest hominids correspond only to bones of human beings who evolved from the first genus Homo, and thus from the first generation of the human species. As a result, the dwarfs, as you always call them, and because of which you have erected various artificial dwarf figures in the center, who were effectively the very first Earth-created human beings, gave rise to the taller, normal-bodied beings who populate the world today in vast excess. However, it must also be clearly explained that the hominid development of the human species did not take place uniformly, but in manifold temporal and spatial gradations, when the process of the actual becoming and the evolutionary adaptation of the Earth-human phenotypic anatomy, in relation to the small stature of the first life form of Earth humans, began about 17 million years ago. These were, however, human beings of normal height and therefore not comparable with the short stature or short stature of the short stature known on Earth today. This short stature is the result of various symptoms of different basic diseases, which impair the growth of the body and the development of the limbs, whereby it is misconceivedly assumed by innocent Earth humans that these short-statured human beings are cognitively handicapped. This, however, corresponds to an unparalleled error and misjudgment, for these human beings, impaired by dwarfism, are as a rule absolutely normal and equal to the so-called normal human beings with regard to the development of consciousness, intellect, reason, and intelligence, and thus also to all cognitive and physical abilities, and thus also with regard to reproduction. Consequently, they are in no way inferior to the normal human beings in these respects. As far as Lake Sonora is concerned, as I have already explained to you, it encompassed the entire area of today's Schmidruti, Sitzberg, and Buhl, or the Perg area, and was therefore a very large lake. On the elevated shore, the terrain was inhabited, namely on an elevated position above the point where the center stands today, whereby you call the terrains in question Hauskanzel and Hinterra Kanzel. This, while today's center is built directly on the spot where at the time of the lake's existence there was a shore covered with phragmites, note Billy. Phragmites equal sign read, as these plants still grow today in the shore zones of water bodies, whereby you came across the old shore ground during excavations under the center and near the shed, and also found Phragmites remains from that time. However, at another time in the past, when my father visited Lake Sonora about 29,800 years ago, he found it no longer there, so he investigated what had happened. And through further visits to the past, he was able to establish that the dam of Lake Sonora had been torn up and washed away by severe earthquakes below where the inlet to the Stone Valley is today. And all that remains to be explained is that my father, according to his annals, remembered the ancient OM teachings that you have rewritten and reproduced in Canon 20, verse 1102, so that some 29,800 years ago in the past, he judged the area around the former Sonora Lake to be so ideal and the hoof of the horse that this must be the place of the sage, as it is already described in the ancient OM. So he decided to mediate at the level of Arahat Athersata that one day, when he had to take over the task of your instruction, you should on the one hand be conceived and born through parents who should have a direct connection to the area of the former lake. And on the other hand, you should also become familiar with the whole area around the former Sonora Lake from your youngest youth, so that one day you can build up a place there to spread the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life for the whole earth world. And through the immeasurable help of the plain Arahat Athersata, despite all the tremendous adversities, the noble intention of my father Sfath has been realized, and so today the center actually exists and works out into the whole world. These, Edward, my dear friend, are the facts from my father's infinite records of his annals, of which I have only become aware in the last few days and can now also tell you.
Fabulous. I too knew nothing of all these things and happenings, but had only the little information Sfath was necessarily obliged to give me, so that I knew where I stood and what I had to do.
That was indeed how my father was, because he only ever explained as much as was necessary. But we shouldn't talk about that now, but about what concerns us, Ptaah. I must begin by addressing what occurred on Era and our other Pleiaren planets some 52,000 years ago. At that time, swinging waves were emitted from the flying sphere, which circled around Era and also around the other Pleiaren planets for 32 days each, which took control of a certain brain region and a precisely defined area in all planet inhabitants, against which there was no possibility of defense, as could be fathomed by our scientists at that time. Our directives do not allow me to explain what the processes were and which areas of the brain and exact regions of the brain were involved, because more precise information for the Earth humans or their brain researchers could lead to findings which they would then, as is usual with Earth scientists when they gain new findings, convert into new useful weapons for wars and secret services and then misuse them for murder, destruction, torture, and for warlike purposes. On the one hand, this would come about via the neuroscientists, who would use everything in such a wise as to manipulate the structure and functioning of the nervous systems of Earth humans in such a manner that they would be destroyed and rendered non-functional. Whole peoples would be exterminated or simply made to suffer and become ill. For example, through the widespread dissemination and radiation of swinging waves causing illness among the Earth humans concerned, who are to be exterminated or harassed. Polyneuropathy and migraine, as well as neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's disease. Autoimmunological diseases such as multiple sclerosis could also be caused, as well as craniocerebral trauma. Strokes, cerebral hemorrhages, epilepsy, brain tumors, and meningitis, etc., against all of which there would no longer be any treatment possibilities and therapy alternatives. Further, diseases of consciousness such as insanity, idiocy, and feeble-mindedness, etc., would also be considered in this respect, as well as incurable depression and psychic disorders, etc.
That would be more than inhumane. But it would be appropriate to explain what happened to you Pleiaren more than 52,000 years ago, respectively how and by what means your peoples of all Pleiaren planets achieved peace and freedom.
But this could indeed oust Arton to get very badly out of control of the good human nature, in the manner you said, which is why I must not consider any further details and explanations and explain anything in more detail. However, I may explain, which I will do only briefly and without elaboration, what happened to our ancestors 52,000 years ago, but I really do not intend to go into detail. It turned out that the swinging wave impulses emitted by the aforementioned spherical flying machine effectively influenced certain areas of the brain of all the planet's inhabitants and had such an effect on special areas that all impulses of violence and degeneracy were appeased, but not extinguished, only put into a softened state and made peaceful. This was sufficient for the populations of all the planets to fall away from all malignant violence and become in a peaceful mood within the time during which the spherical flying machine circled the worlds. But nevertheless, they retained their free will and, above all, without external verbal influences from the state leaders and their unpeaceful propaganda, etc., they became more and more inclined to rationality and intellect and began to think, consider, decide, and act independently. The calming, swinging wave influences, which acted only on certain areas of the brain and in these only on special areas, were neither aggressive nor compelling, for there were only vibratory impulses through which understanding and reason were stimulated and led to the populations discarding their collective world of thought within a few days. Because they became free from all the unpeaceful, suggestive collective thinking controlled by the governments and religions, and were able to form their own independent thoughts and opinions. By very quickly discarding their collective thinking controlled by governments and religions, and also very quickly learning and using their own individual thoughts, the human beings of the Pleiaren planets learned and grasped their personal self-knowledge and formed their own and ever-increasing self-determination, through which they attained personal mental strength. In a special way, the dropping and abandonment of all religious belief factors and thus the perception and realization of the natural creational laws, which are universally oriented towards peacefulness, freedom, and self-reliance, had an effect. When this was recognized by all Pleiaren populations of all our worlds, and every religious belief was discarded and frowned upon, manifold realizations were formed, and from them the result of personal attitudes and far-reaching thought processes and certainties, which led to all human beings of all peoples setting themselves independently challenging goals and sticking to them even under difficulties, learning to cope with failures better and well, working out a higher motivation and achieving their set self-realization goals. It was also found that within only 11 days they were less and less distracted by the opinions of other persons, and above all, also no longer allowed themselves to be distracted by the suggestive, unpeaceful whispers of the government, nor allowed themselves to fall back into unpeacefulness. On the contrary, all the populations of all the planets henceforth made all the necessary efforts and perseverance to achieve their goals. Very quickly, they became aware of their own abilities and just as quickly learned to control and master situations of all kinds that arose and quickly became mentally strong persons who also learned to make use of their abilities by constantly seeking and finding new challenges for their intellect and reason, as well as for their self-development and self-realization, and by realizing them as well as themselves. Thus, within a very short time, the individual human beings learn to cope with stress and strain and to live in control of all their self-created personality traits. Through their steadily growing mental strength, they very quickly created a consciousness-like capacity that also had a strong effect on their mental and physical health, as well as on the fact that they were always setting themselves new, challenging goals and realizing them. And all this, together with many other positive developments, finally led within only 32 days, during which the orbital aircraft circled the worlds, to all persons of all, populations finally freeing themselves independently and according to their own free will from all Ausartungen, getting very badly out of control of their good human natures, and from all violence and immorality, etc., through the unimaginably strong swinging wave impulses of evolutionary effect, which were emitted by the flying sphere and influenced the personalities of all our Pleiaren planets. All human beings became aware within a very short time that they were being influenced externally by other persons. Forces and populist and unpeaceful government-controlled influences which were hostile to peace, degenerate, inciting violence and destructive, as well as impairing the intellect and reason, negative and malignant, and were influencing them negatively against their own will and causing them to lapse into violence, etc. This realization led the human beings of all our planets to renounce violence, immorality, degeneracy, evil, and wickedness, and also to conquer their bad habits. It was also recognized, however, that in spite of all knowledge and efforts with regard to the conduct of life in the good, the correct, the human, and with regard to righteousness, as well as with regard to the observance of the natural positive creational laws, the human being always remains susceptible and can fall back again into old, ungood, negative, evil, and bad behavior if he does not make the necessary effort to control it in order to prevent it. And it has been recognized that this can always happen again if the human beings are influenced from the outside in any verbal, physical or consciousness, thought, emotion, and psyche-burdening forms for long enough. So in this respect, all human beings of all Pleiaren planets or their populations were subordinated to this natural creative law of action in such a way that countermeasures had to be taken, which were recorded and followed in directives, and which consisted in the fact that no direct or otherwise harmful connections were to be sought and maintained with alien worlds and their populations, in order not to relapse into the old modes of behavior through such contacts with alien peoples who were not like our ancestors. We Pleiaren of today are also human beings, like our ancestors 52,000 years ago and all our descendants since then, who must resist such external influences without being harmed. For unfortunately, we are still susceptible to negative external influences that would cause us to relapse into the old ways of behavior if we were to fall long enough into areas of negative influence that were harmful to us and were hit by factors that had a negative effect on us. We Pleiaren, too, are human beings and are ordered to develop within the framework of every natural creational order and lawfulness, through a very laborious working out of our higher evolution of consciousness, which even after 52,000 years of peace, we must follow and continue to learn. And this we can do today through the life teaching of Nocodemion, the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, which helps us unspeakably much in our further evolution of consciousness, but which was known to us only in small parts up to the beginning of your mission, but which you now bring and teach not only to Earth humans, but also to us in many expanded versions. But as far as our ancestors were concerned, more than 52,000 years ago. They only gained their knowledge at that time and only then became aware of the effective facts and values of life according to the natural creational laws, when the flying sphere appeared and circled around our Pleiadian planets, whereby all Pleiadian populations were struck by its vibratory impulses and were appeased and peacefully tuned in a restrained yet definite and effective manner. Through these vibratory impulses, their minds and reason were stimulated, whereby the populations turned to the gently urging peaceful impulses and gave themselves consciously learning to their evolution of consciousness. Through this attention, our ancestors of that time recognized the truth and effectiveness of the natural creational laws and correct natural creative conditioned way of life, learned to fathom them and to follow them and made them their own, whereby henceforth all populations consciously developed according to them and aligned themselves to them in every way. But they were able to do all this only after they realized that their entire very high technical development in all its forms and possibilities did not turn them away from their degenerations, their violent behavior, and from all evil, from all warfare and all destructive and negative and evil behavior with regard to peace, real freedom, righteousness, justice, and humanity, as well as a way of life according to natural creational laws. Only through the influence of the vibrational impulses, which were emitted by the spherical flying device and by which they were peacefully influenced, did they find their way to personal change and finally, through their own development of consciousness, cognition and their efforts, their own will, their intellect, their reason, and the use of their intelligence, they attained their personal inner peace, their personal inner freedom and righteousness. And this inestimable gain and victory over themselves they also began to bring to bear externally, whereby all peoples also allied themselves among themselves in a continuing state of peace and freedom. And since then, all violence, degenerations, and wars, etc., have also become a thing of the past. However, it must be repeated as a fact that all violence, wars, all hatred and falsehood, all discord, all unfreedom and unrighteousness, as well as all injustice and degeneracy, etc., in all forms, could only be ended. In all forms could only be brought to an end when the vibratory impulses of the orb had an effect upon all the Pleiadian peoples and soothed them into peace, whereby they became consciously powerful of their own independent and externally uninfluenced faculty of thought, as well as of their intellect, their reason, and the application of their intelligentsia, and thereby their own self-evolution could take place. This did not mean, however, that our ancestors 52,000 years ago, or since, were above any susceptibility to and reversion to the old degenerate, malignant, warlike, violent, and all other negative forms and disregarding all natural creational laws. And this is not the case even in modern times, for even we Pleiadian of today are not immune to this, just as all our ancestors were not. This is well known to us Pleiadian, and we also know through the teaching of Nocodemion that in order to be above all susceptibility and backsliding into the old negative patterns of degenerations, violence, wars, hatred, falsehood and wickedness, etc., it takes much more than just the change to peace, freedom, justice, and righteousness, etc. in the human being, and that all this cannot simply be worked out through the normal development of understanding, reason, intelligence, and knowledge. But this very much more is only possible for a human being, no matter who, how, what, and from where he is, whether from Earth, from our Pleiadian planets, or elsewhere, when very thoroughly and intensively throughout all times it is learned to perceive reality and the truth contained therein, and to implement all the resulting knowledge for self and self-development in a correct, positive, and evolutionary way. And the comprehensive realization which gradually matured in all the human beings of our Pleiadian populations also led to the realization of the fact that all becoming of all natural creative flourishing requires long periods of time, which in this respect led all Plejaran peoples to the realization and understanding that they would never stop learning, but would have to learn all their lives and keep on learning, because learning would never come to an end, but would continue endlessly, and also in every new life in relation to every new personality. So it became clear and understandable that learning must never end, and therefore must always continue in each new life of each new personality for many millennia. Decades, thousands, centuries, thousands, and millions of years until the eventual entrance into the higher planes of the High Council and higher. But this also meant, and this was recognized in the course of time, that throughout all the times that the human being incarnates again and again as a new personality and exists and lives as a material life form, he must endlessly learn and keep on learning. Which is why he, as a learning human being, will also never be immune from making mistakes again and again in order to learn from them and to continue everything better and learning positively. However, this was also connected with the realization that as a result of the lifelong learning process of each new personality, there was also the danger and possibility, connected with and timeless throughout all new incarnations and new personalities, of falling back into the old behavior patterns of earlier personalities, despite each higher development achieved. But it was recognized that especially suggestive verbal, thought and emotion-related influences, as well as consciousness and psychic disturbances, and manifold deed-related external influences from fellow human beings can bring about and cause very negative relapses with regard to behavior of every kind. And this realization that such outside influences from fellow human beings have a suggestive effect and provoke and evoke relapses into old negative behavior patterns and ultimately allow them to be broken through, led to directives being drawn up which warned against and forbade this, that henceforth no more off-planet contacts and connections were to be cultivated with peoples or individual life forms whose life and behavioral evolutionary level, as well as their consciousness, thought, feeling, psyche, action, and reason rationality was lower than the general average of the Plejaran population in this respect. And these directives have been preserved throughout the ages up to the present day, and thus continue to be valid even into the most distant future. This is because we have known for 52,000 years through the teachings of Nocodemion, which you impart to our humanity as well as to Earth humans, that through various external suggestive or any other negative influences, the susceptibility to relapse into old negative patterns and norms is always given in all human beings in universal breadth. Consequently, we Plejaran are also disadvantaged by such energies and forces acting upon us and could relapse into old behavior patterns. But we have to protect ourselves against this, whereby we behave in this respect according to our directives, fulfill them unswervingly in observance and compliance, and therefore run no risk of suffering any harm. Through the teaching of Nocodemion, which you impart to us, we now also know that the human being is so long prone to setbacks and relapses into old negative forms of old behavior, until he no longer needs his material body, which will only be when his spirit form enters the higher plane of the High Council. Only then will the consciousness of the human being have reached a higher stage of evolution and can also profit from it and usefully perceive, apply, and effectively implement the ever-positive impulses from the spirit form in consciousness. But if this is not the case, then the possibility of danger always remains with regard to susceptibility and backsliding into old negative mental and behavioral patterns, etc., which is why it must always be fought against, and everything must be consciously controlled, so that a relapse into the old degenerated patterns is avoided. And this danger of relapse always exists in any case, and with every human being if he is suggestively influenced from outside in his consciousness, his intellect, his reason, and his intelligence, etc., and if his spirit form has also not yet evolved to a sufficiently high degree. But this is also the case with us Pleiaren in this way, because our consciousness and intellect, our reason and our intelligentsia, due to the lack of a sufficiently high evolution of consciousness, are still susceptible to degenerated external influences of every possible kind, whereby in particular linguistic and deed-related influences from outside and behavioral patterns of human beings directly affecting us are such that they could have a negative effect on us and throw us back into the old degenerations and effects which were still peculiar to our ancestors 52,000 years ago, and from which we must also protect ourselves in the present time and still very far into the future. In this respect, respectively, also our very highly developed technology of every kind cannot protect us, since we can only use it for ourselves in many other ways, whereas we are dependent on our intellect, our reason, our intelligence, and our directives in every respect with regard to our evolution, mentality, and all our behavior in order to preserve and not to endanger the high values of life of every kind and manner, which we have continuously acquired through our ancestors and ourselves. And this corresponds to something that may seem incomprehensible to the majority of Earth humans, as well as to the fact that, for these reasons, we cannot and must not get involved in any direct or other contacts and connections with other thinking and other living life forms or human beings such as Earth humans. This fact is therefore one of the most important reasons why we Pleiaren hold back and, in accordance with our security and our directives created in this respect, are not allowed to enter into any direct or telepathic contact or any form of technical communication with persons and peoples of other worlds. This is precisely when they are not like our Pleiaren values in their forms of mentality and behavior, as well as in their way of life and in their use of intellect, reason and intelligence, etc., but are degenerate and violent to the contrary, as well as criminally deficient in respect of righteousness and the observance of the natural creational laws, as is very distinctly the case with Earth humans, among whom only very few exceptions are to be found, who, if not extensively, yet at least in part, endeavor to learn a better, positive, and natural, creative, correct way of life. The negative factors mentioned, as they are drastically present in Earth humans, also occur in the third grouping as well as in the Earth future beings, who on the one hand have already been on Earth for thousands of years or otherwise for a considerable time, again and again demonstrating their presence in various ways. These explanations should suffice, for I have thus clarified the most important facts.
All this has already been explained to me by your father Svath, as well as by you. Your daughters Simyase, Quetzal, and Asket, but I thought that the whole thing should be explained openly once in a conversation by you, which you have now done. Very many thanks for that, Ptaah. Your explanation will certainly help some Earthlings to understand why you strictly hold back. For example, why you could not get involved in any direct way with an earthly government, but only through my intermediary. And why the whole thing could not come about in this way with regard to the attempt to establish an indirect contact with the U.S. government through me. You have also clarified and established, namely that an unfair business was carried out by which scared you off and led to the realization that an honest attempt at contact with the Earthlings is impossible. Even your first attempt at contact with an earthly government, namely with the USA, was intended through my mediation, and was to be brought about by the person I commissioned for this purpose, but unfortunately everything was doomed to failure from the start through deceit and fraud. In this respect, too, it was and is therefore to be said that honesty cannot lead to success through deceit and fraud, but only through effective honesty itself, which can only lead to something valuable and lasting from a natural creative point of view. In this respect, too, reality and truth are the fundamental values of everything. Although many Earthlings manipulate or try to shape reality and its truth to their own benefit and advantage, depending on their whim, which often makes many things impossible and destroys them. Reality and truth, however, cannot be separated on the one hand because they form a unity, And on the other hand, it is not understood what reality and truth really mean, which is why I would also now like to express in our conversation what is to be understood by them. I find this necessary because since ancient times, through many philosophers, such as Aristotle, Democritus, Friedrich Nietzsche, René Descartes, Confucius, Petrus Abelardus, Francis Bacon, Kant and Hegel and many other wise men, the concept of truth has never really been defined, but only made blamelessly incomprehensible with nonsensical attempts at explanation, and is also still made misunderstandable and incomprehensible today with nonsensical attempts at explanation. This has also happened in many other ways, such as in dialectical materialism, in American pragmatism and subjective idealism, in consensus theory, through pragmatic truth and the coherence theory of truth, etc., whereby a distinction is also made between a predicative and an attributive concept of truth, etc. So I think I will give a clear explanation of what you Ptaah understand by the concept of truth, just as I learned it from your father's Svath instruction, and hope that I can still render it correctly as he taught me, and according to which the concept of truth can basically only be defined in such a way that it becomes comprehensible what is to be understood by the value truth. Truth is founded in the perception and cognition of reality, and thus in a reflection of it, for the truth anchored in reality, which alone is true to reality, corresponds to an absolute agreement in logic, that is to say consistency, and proves the authenticity, genuineness, purity and correctness of real reality, which as such has no possibility of doubt, and this in every respect with reference to an effectively real, true state of affairs, that is to say an irrefutable fact of a statement. Assertion, existence, occurrence, action, speech, emotion, situation, thing, deed, presence, occurrence, or conduct, which has taken place, exists, is made, is present, or is to take place in the future.
My explanation did not go far because if I had to explain everything in more detail, there would not have been enough time today. And as for your explanation regarding the concept of truth, to that I must say that you were an unusually good student of my father, and your memory leaves nothing to be desired, as you sometimes say on certain occasions.
It was not necessary, and it did not have to be, for what you have explained is quite sufficient, and shows what it was like when peace came to your peoples, and why you Ptaah refrain in any way from contact with earthlings, earth foreigners and earth future. And I think that, according to your directives, you also refrain from contact with other planetary peoples who do not belong to your federation, and who do not fit into your pattern of development and behavior. So, from my point of view, it should not be necessary to explain more in this regard. Thanks for your effort.
What you think and say is indeed in line with our directions and behavior.
But what you say in relation to my memory is not generally so, because after my health breakdown and my partial amnesia, I forgot a lot from my personal life history and did not refresh it. What was important for me was basically only related to my missionary work, which is why I have only reprocessed all the knowledge necessary in this regard, which alone cost me a great deal of effort. But if I had also had to bring my life story back up to scratch, then I would have failed miserably, because everything would have been too much, and I would no longer be able to fulfill my work today. But as far as your abbreviated explanations are concerned, it was not necessary, and it was not necessary to say more, for what you have explained is quite sufficient, and shows what happened at that time when peace came to your peoples, and why you Ptaah refrain in every way from contacts with earthlings, earth foreigners and earth to be. And I think that, according to your directives, you also refrain from contact with other planetary peoples who do not belong to your federation, and who do not fit into your pattern of development and behavior. So, from my point of view, it should not be necessary to explain more in this regard. Thanks for your effort. But what would certainly be necessary to explain is why Earth humans live in degenerations of violence, murder and manslaughter, torture, coercion, wars, revolutions, terrorism, rape, destruction, and with lies, deceit, hatred, discord, lack of freedom, injustice, unrighteousness and slander, etc., etc. The whole of this is not only a matter of the degeneration of individual earthlings, and also not only the case with the absolute majority of the human beings of the earth, but in reality, with 99.6% of the entire population of the earth, as your father Svath already told me after the end of the World War, when he explained to me the cause of all the evil of the human beings of the earth, which is not normal, naturally, creatively innate, but was created by the human beings themselves and has been passed on genetically endlessly from generation to generation since time immemorial. It has been passed on from generation to generation, and will also be passed on into the future. And this is unfortunately the case that human beings, and by this I mean specifically the Earthling, as I have learned from Svath and you, have degenerated through their own actions. But it must be clear that in the vastness of the universe, there are also other human beings and life forms who are equally sick in the head and live with degenerations of all kinds, unpeaceful and unrighteous, and therefore also make their existence hell by their own doing in a similar or the same way as the Earthlings. And as Svath has already said, it can be said that the absolute majority of all human and human-like creatures in our entire Dern universe have, through their own early degenerations, fallen into a convergent state with that of degenerated Earth humans. This, however, can one day lead to enormous unpleasantness, and even to acts of war with extraterrestrials, and to the danger of the extermination or enslavement of Earth humans, as well as to the annexation of Earth by Earth foreigners. And it is precisely in this respect that crazy Earth foreigners, who do not possess reason, rationality, and intelligence for a penny, have done everything with the SETI project so that it can happen under certain circumstances if Earth foreigners find the SETI probe. Through this crazy project, extraterrestrials are to be made aware of Earth, and contact is to be sought with them. And what it is all about, I have copied here in this expression from Wikipedia.
Wikipedia. SETI at Home is a volunteer computing project of the University of California, Berkeley, which is concerned with the search for extraterrestrial intelligent life. Search for extraterrestrial intelligence, also known as SETI for short, refers to the search for extraterrestrial civilizations. Since 1960, various scientific projects have been carried out which, among other things, examine the radio range of the electromagnetic spectrum for possible signs and signals of technical civilizations in space. Basics and estimations. SETI research is based on the assumption that extraterrestrial cultures exist in space and use similar communication systems and message technologies as on Earth. So far, it is not known whether extraterrestrial life exists or whether there are other technical civilizations capable of transmitting and receiving interstellar signals. The astronomer Frank Drake attempted an estimate of this with the Drake equation. An optimistic estimate of the factors in this equation yields a possible number of over 300 such civilizations in the Milky Way. Stephen Dole was the first to estimate the number of possible habitable worlds in the galaxy in a study for the RAND Corporation in 1964. The Kardashev scale is used to estimate possible technical possibilities of extraterrestrial civilizations. The galaxy in which Earth is located, the Milky Way, has a diameter of about 100,000 light-years and contains between 200 and 400 billion stars, and, according to findings from the Kepler mission, 50 billion planets, of which an estimated 500 million planets are in habitable zones. Further analyses of the Kepler data and investigations with the Keck telescope as of 2013 suggest a much higher number of planets in habitable zones within the Milky Way.
But all this is actually only a side note, because I wanted to explain what Svath taught me about evil, which has dominated the 99.6% of the Earthlings since time immemorial, thereby causing catastrophe after catastrophe and disaster after disaster and slowly destroying the whole of nature, its fauna and flora, and also the planet through their delusion of constantly growing overpopulation, which is being bred further and further. And with regard to all the degeneracy that dominates the Earthling or the human beings of the Earth, Svath explained to me that this evil was genetically deposited in man long ago as degenerations, through his own fault. I learned from your father that various factors play very important roles in the development of degenerations in human beings, but that human beings are not simply helplessly at the mercy of these factors, but can bring them under control through reason, intelligence, and free judgment, and can control their lives and lead them in peace, freedom, love, righteousness, balance, helpfulness, and behavior in accordance with natural creational laws. Therefore, he is not forced to do anything degenerate or evil, because in principle he can determine for himself, through understanding, reason, intelligence, insight, and his own will, etc., how, whether or not he wants to do something and what he wants to do, both for good and for evil or in the negative and positive. Exactly this fact, however, the earthling, due to disinterest and laziness of thought, does not take note of. Consequently, he also makes no effort whatsoever to make something useful of himself, precisely a human being, to whom effective humanity or true human beinghood is inherent. Even easily comprehensible and understandable, everything good, love, correct, valuable, and every correct behavior can be explained to him according to natural creative order and lawfulness. But every word of every explanation goes unheard, like a still barely audible breath of wind in the desert. The human being's traditional genetic burden of degeneracy, inhumanity, evil, violence, murder, killing, overpopulation, rape, torture, lying, deceit, and slander, as well as war, terror, falsehood, and all-round destruction, has become so inherent and self-evident to the earthling that he wallows in it and is satisfied with it. But where and what is hidden as a secret behind everything, namely how and where everything comes into being in the brain, is of no concern to human beings, just as it is of no concern to human beings what gives rise to all degenerations, both good and bad, or negative and positive, in all their manifold forms. So the human being is not interested in the fact that everything, depending on its nature, emerges from consciousness as the finest and most harmless breath of an idea and a thought arising from it, whereby the actual origin is founded in the frontal lobe of the brain, as well as in the so-called paired core area of the brain or in the medial part of the respective temporal lobe, where the stimulus response center is located, in which good or bad or negative or positive emotional effects are created by the feelings arising from thoughts. And this happens through thought-feeling influences, which are caused by environmental conditions and all kinds of outside influences, fellow human beings and their machinations and other influences, etc., as well as through the blood sugar content of the human being, which in an important way influences and even controls the function of the stimulus response center. The truth is that the higher the blood sugar level, the more the human being is inclined towards peace, love, balance, righteousness, and altruism, as well as more consciously dealing with and being connected to freedom and justice, whereas in the other case, precisely when the human being lives in the grip of his degenerations and willingly or unwillingly follows them through his evil and negative behavior, the blood sugar level is below average. But this has nothing to do, as Svath taught me, with the fact that human beings can increase their blood sugar content through a large oral sugar intake or through sugar injections directly into the blood, and therefore become better, more peaceful, and more selfless. Because according to Svath's explanation, a certain substance in the blood sugar is the decisive factor that causes the corresponding reaction in the stimulus response center. I do not remember the name of the substance, but it shouldn't be particularly important. Whereas the fact, as Svath said, that this blood sugar substance is influenced by thoughts and feelings and causes the correspondingly important reaction in the stimulus response center. This also means that if the human being also eats a lot of sweets, and thus wants to let his blood sugar rise, but lives without good, valuable, positive, loving, peaceful, and free impulses with regard to his thoughts and the feelings arising from them, he cannot produce the corresponding blood sugar substance, and the substance that is lacking in this respect can neither be created nor used by the stimulus response center. But further, it is also to be said that thoughts and feelings produce the actual neurophysiological reactions in the brain, whereby the fundamental truth is that these can only take place in the stimulus response center, although the human being, however, can only influence this center with great difficulty. If he nevertheless wants to influence it and bring it under his conscious control, then he must become master of himself and of all his impulses in every relationship, and thus also become a true human being, which, however, requires not only years of intensive, severe, and painful learning, abstaining and enduring often vicious adversity. The whole thing requires decades of deprivation-laden learning and development, through which everything must be regulated that has been formed in the human being since the earliest primeval times and has been passed down genetically to the present time, and will also continue to be inherited into the distant future. Effectively, the degenerations are anchored in every single human being on Earth, as a result of which everyone is burdened with the inheritance of a profound intrusion, which corresponds to an original degenerative development, through which the remembering and re-experiencing of psychotraumatic events, and thus precisely the degenerations of all kinds created in primeval times, are unconsciously drilling or superficially pressing, but finally effectively breaking out and becoming active in various ways, be it verbally or through indirect or direct forms of degeneration according to corresponding negative or positive proliferating behavior. Now I have again digressed somewhat from what still needs to be said with regard to the stimulus response center, for this works, according to Svath's explanations, with the erroneous impulses emanating from the frontal lobe, whereby not only the stimulus response increases, but with it also its energy and its power, which express themselves negatively or positively in the human being, because fundamentally and by nature both factors are given. It then only depends on what the human being makes use of these two energies and forces, whether in a positive or negative way, whereby, however, the negative usually predominates and is simply let run and allowed to break through because, as the old saying goes, the path of least resistance is the easiest and is therefore chosen and followed. Consequently, the thoughts that arise and burst forth from consciousness and the feelings that result from them are not controlled in any way, but are simply allowed to run wild, constantly increasing until they become a mighty force and finally, negatively or positively, erupt. In a negative way it then happens, and the negative has been predominant since time immemorial, that not reactions of joy, love, peace, justice, and righteousness become predominant, but fear, hatred, vindictiveness, discord, injustice and lack of freedom, violence, coercion, and anger that can no longer be contained. Ultimately, this leads to the outbreak and execution of vicious and uncontrollable degenerations, up to misanthropy Wikipedia, Greek. Usein misin to hate, to reject, and anthropos, human being, which corresponds to a way of seeing and acting of a human being who hates human beings, becomes a murderer, manslayer, or mass murderer, or at least rejects their proximity. Under certain circumstances, such a human being becomes a misanthrope, a hater of human beings and a misanthrope, whereby he or she no longer has any feelings of concern for his or her fellow human beings, and consequently acts in this way without hesitation and without control, as happens in the worst possible way in torture, rape, mass murder, and especially in wars, in which human beings specifically act out their degenerations. But in contrast to the misanthrope is the altruist, who is a philanthropist and unselfish human being, who is largely able to keep himself free of the degenerations he has inherited since time immemorial through control, self-discipline, and humanity, which, however, is always only dependent on the time and situation. This is because every human being who is also altruistically trained, built up, and empowered remains susceptible to his inherited degenerations, in spite of all altruistic effort and control with regard to himself, his impulses of thoughts and feelings as well as his behavior, which can break through unexpectedly through some nasty inner or outer influence and circumstance, whereby, as I have already mentioned, the disastrous, fatal, ruinous, disastrous, ungracious, evil, precarious, bad and evil, the negative and precisely the angry, destructive, and I will say the Mephistophelic is always in the foreground. And that evil is then usually expressed, and erupts, is especially the case with human beings when they have special physical characteristics, such as a reduced function of the autonomous nervous system. This is responsible for the regulation of the heartbeat, as well as for breathing, blood pressure, digestion, metabolism, the sexual organs and perspiration, and the eye muscles, whereby thoughts and the resulting feelings and the psyche influenced by them have a very important function, which is particularly noticeable and perceptible in anger, anxiety, fear, hatred, discontent, and rage. When the autonomic nervous system is impaired, this has an extreme effect on the human being's heartbeat, and also on his blood pressure and thus also on his degenerations. And this is because when the heartbeat has a slowed down function, and consequently also the blood pressure is balanced at a low value, an urge to activity arises, in which the way to the urge to action, or rather the urge to be active, is usually the next best thing. The path to action or activism usually leads via the path of least resistance, that is to say, via the subterranean workings of the degenerations pushing into the foreground and letting them break out. If this circumstance actually occurs, then the entire nervous system is overloaded and leads to an explosion, or rather, the degenerations that prevail deep inside force their way out, break out and degenerate. Namely, as a result of the traditional inheritance of the degenerations, in a vicious, angry verbalism or in physical acts of violence, murder and manslaughter, torture, rape and terror, as well as the most diverse inhuman behavior. Basically, then, because I have to explain the whole thing again in a little more detail, I have to say that the frontal lobe and the stimulus response center are the basic originating factors in the brain of human beings, where everything begins to act. At first, the whole thing happens as an inconspicuous idea, and then from a thought resulting from it, from which words or actions then manifest themselves according to the personal impulses, ideas, fantasies, and wishes, etc., according to one's own will, just shaped in a good or bad, that is to say, negative or positive way. The whole thing, however, first develops in a subterranean, somehow secret, unofficial, and I would like to say sterile form, unknown to the human being, and in an impersonal way, as a result of which everything takes place as if it were not something that concerns the human beings concerned themselves. In other words, I mean that he does not recognize the whole as his very own product, and therefore does not accept it as such. But when he becomes aware of it, he sees it as the work of events and situations, and as the product and result of the machinations of fellow human beings, society, and the environment. In this way, however, he loses his independence and connects himself with fellow human beings and society, as well as with all their machinations, be it in terms of views, hypotheses, impulses of all kinds, such as hatred, lies, violence, torture, slander, words, actions, and all other degenerate behavior. This means that the human being no longer sees himself in this way, but only as a dependent segment of society, humanity, or a grouping whose rules, laws, orders, etc., and whose resulting behavior become his own in every respect. Consequently, his very own individuality is thereby obliterated, and he becomes, unthinkingly, will-lessly and irresponsibly, the tool of whatever acts upon him suggestively from outside in a good, bad, positive or negative way, be it from society, from individual fellow human beings, a group, through bondage, through politics or religious and sectarian delusions of faith, military might, terrorism, philosophy or science, etc., all of which trigger stimulus reactions in the human being.
There is nothing more to be said about your explanation, because what my father has taught you, what you have learnt, and what you have explained should be enough. However, you mentioned the term Mephistophely, which is unknown to me, despite my knowledge of your mother tongue and also of the German language. Consequently, I think that this word is one that you have created yourself, just as you are constantly creating new words and terms elsewhere. Mephistopheles, that is to say Mephisto, is familiar to me as the name of the or a devil in the Faust material, which is why I assume you are referring to the devilish with your new term.
Yes, but it is also not difficult to guess. In Faust's case, however, it is a servant spirit who was called upon for assistance, or was magically summoned as a paredros or assessor and spiritus familiaris, or good household spirit or family confidant, and according to the name was regarded or assumed by Faust to be the conscience personified.
You should name the frontal lobe with today's earthly technical term.
What it's called, I'm afraid I do not know.
The term is prefrontal cortex.
Thanks. But I think to all that I have explained that few Earthlings will really care and think in depth about how that has been the case since time immemorial, and will also continue to be the case.
With regard to many things and factors, the majority of Earth humans are not amenable to understanding and reason, but only to confused faith, as a result of which knowledge and truth are disregarded, not considered, and also not comprehended, contrary to understanding and reason. This is also because, as I have to recognize time and again in my observations of Earth humans, warnings as well as explanations are not really perceived and consequently, as a rule, are also effectively misunderstood due to a lack of reflection and then also interpreted in a manner alien to reality.
Yes, and in this respect I have unfortunately already had to experience a lot and make many experiences, because fundamentally everything is based on the fact that on the one hand it is not heard correctly, and therefore on the other hand it cannot be thought about when any facts, things, situations, events, or occurrences, etc. are explained. Therefore, the rule is that precisely because nothing correct is heard, nothing important is perceived, and nothing is thought about. When I repeat it, as a result of not realizing, not thinking about, and not considering what is being said, everything is taken wrongly, and therefore automatically there is simply an immediate rejection and counterattack. This inevitably leads to misunderstandings, which could usually be prevented if one first thought about what was mentioned, said, and explained, instead of simply answering and countering in a confused manner. On the other hand, it is also the case that explanations, warnings, and all kinds of information that are given, such as to the public media, etc., in order to make them known to the public, are simply left unanswered and consequently concealed from human society, while those who warn are insulted as idiots, do-gooders, liars, cheats, swindlers, and fools, as was done in the 1940s and 1950s, and also in later years with regard to me when I tried to make predictions, etc. public. Everything was only ridiculed and destroyed. Also, all the predictions listed in the book Prophecies and Predictions, which I sent to many public media and governments, etc. And all the prophecies and predictions from the 1940s and 1950s, and also from all later years, are now coming true in a terrible way. This is because the prophecies and predictions have not been heeded, and Earth humans continue to be criminally bred, through whose equally criminal machinations nature and its fauna and flora. The climate and the waters have been largely destroyed, many life forms irrevocably wiped out, and the planet itself tremendously harassed. It is absolutely pointless to repeat the individual predictions, for they have been described by me many times in various letters, bulletins, and books, and have been spread throughout the earthly world. But out of this, and out of all the effort, there was no valuable resonance through which all the bad things could have been avoided, which today are the order of the day in the whole world as natural disasters, suffering, hardship, misery, wars, crimes, and manifold evils, and will become much worse in the future. Through my prophecies and the various predictions, I have pointed out and openly stated time and again since the 1940s and until today what will happen and take place in the future, and thus also in the present time, just as it is actually happening in the whole world today. But still no attention is paid to it. But everything is only ridiculed, just as everything of my predictions is concealed by the public media of all kinds. Furthermore, and I should actually also mention this, on the one hand the media, if they already mention any particular things, still falsify everything according to their own interpretations, twist it and often even reproduce it in a mendacious and slanderous manner. This, while on the other hand, the statistics that are compiled are also only based on assumptions and presumptions and on false calculations, because the statisticians have no possibility whatsoever to really fathom, record, and evaluate the effective facts and facts, as, among other things, with regard to the effective number of the entire Earth humans, whereby they currently calculate, for example, in October 2018, the world population at around 7.63 billion human beings. And these false conjectural calculations are in contrast to your very accurate figures which you play and show, according to your annual censuses, and which listed the Earth human population on the 31st of December 2017 as 844,128,000 0028 billion, 844,128,002 Earth humans, far more than the Earth statisticians therefore fabulate. The annual growth of Earth humans, which has been between 100 and 110 million human beings for years, is also harmlessly trivialized by the statisticians, although the UN also makes false growth forecasts within the same framework, for it expects a population growth of around 78 million human beings per year for the period from 2015 to 2020, whereas the United Nations expects around 9.7 billion human beings on the globe by 2050. This, however, corresponds to pathologically erroneous and confused claims that deviate far from reality and truth, because effectively the world population is growing at a much more extensive rate than the clever statisticians and other clever people can imagine and claim when they talk cleverly and palaver stupidly about the Earth's population. In truth, they have not even the slightest idea of what corresponds to the reality and truth of the whole in relation to overpopulation, consequently also not about its real growth and its worldwide destructive manifold machinations. As regarding the destruction of nature, the poisoning and extinction of fauna and flora, the dangerous changing influences on the atmosphere and the climate, the poisoning and pollution of the seas, fresh waters and the cultivation of food for all life, just like human beings, animals and creatures, etc. Nor do these big-headed experts think about the fact, as do all the other responsible people in the world, who only talk big, make stupid speeches and pretend to be smart, but in reality are as dumb as beans, that through the destructive machinations triggered by overpopulation, which are becoming more and more blatant, everything is being inexorably destroyed, annihilated, and wiped out. The fact is that overpopulation and its all-destroying machinations are driving not only nature, fauna and flora, the entire environment and all seas and freshwaters, but also humanity itself into ruin, misery, and a catastrophe beyond compare, which is slowly but surely doing everything it can to exterminate itself. And the statisticians are busy lying that there are fewer and fewer births, thus downplaying and denying the huge annual increase in the world's population. And this because the number of births may have fallen somewhat in Switzerland and Germany, but this does not apply to the whole world. It is also fundamentally concealed that every year around 100 million human beings from previous births become capable of procreation, who then of course also produce offspring, whether intentionally or unintentionally, in addition to those who are continuously conceived and brought into the world by the already existing world population. Thus, every year many millions of new procreators are added to the already existing procreating mass, as a result of which those who have been procreating and creating offspring for years accumulate year after year. Thus, the otherwise already unreasonably produced masses of offspring are multiplied every year by the new procreators, which however is not recorded by the statisticians, and thus humanity is lied to with regard to population growth. Also, the death rate in the entire Earth humans is not able to reduce the excess of the Earth's population and, in connection with the enormous birth rate, not to reduce it in such a way that the overpopulation would decrease in number. On the contrary, it is growing in increasing measure. And the greater the overpopulation, the greater and more enormous the resulting problems and destruction of nature, fauna and flora, the oceans and freshwaters, the entire environment, the climate and the planet itself. Mass overpopulation requires all kinds of measures that inevitably have an overall negative and destructive effect on the planet. Its nature, fauna and flora, forests, waters of all kinds, the atmosphere, the climate and the environment. And this is a fact that is neither seen nor understood by the so-called experts of environmental protection, nor by politicians, rulers and Earth humans themselves, because they all go blindly and stupidly through the world and can neither recognize nor want to understand that it is precisely all the machinations that emanate from overpopulation that destroy and destroy everything all around and cause tremendous catastrophes of all kinds, which also include the tremendous natural catastrophes. These catastrophes also include diseases and epidemics that will spread more and more in the future, with various ones from Africa, Arabia, Asia, South America, and from the USA, also creeping more and more into Europe and spreading to bring much disaster and death. Forest fires in various countries are also part of this, which have been raging in the USA again and again for years and claim human lives as well as in other countries, with many houses burning and countless wild animals dying in the process. And this is also only due to the irresponsible machinations of overpopulation, because residential buildings are placed in the forests, which go up in flames due to lightning strikes or malicious arson, resulting in enormous bush and forest fires. Fertile land is also built up with houses and factories, with sales centers, sports facilities, roads, paths, and airfields, etc., as necessary machinations to meet the needs of the inexorably growing overpopulation. But also the overpopulation-related machinations are to be mentioned, which are carried out with regard to sports facilities for the masses of people of the overpopulation. In the foreground are all vehicles, aeroplanes, helicopters, ships, cars, motorbikes, and other vehicles of all kinds, which are operated by explosion engines and which are used senselessly and irresponsibly for sporting events such as races, etc., but which not only pollute the atmosphere and air, but also affect the climate, destroy its normal course, and through the poisonous exhaust gases also endanger the health of the earthlings and all other life forms. This is in addition to the fact that the majority of the entire agricultural and horticultural enterprises apply enormous tonnages of diverse toxic substances that are dangerous to all life, causing diseases and epidemics in all life forms of fauna and flora as well as in the human beings, whereby many human beings die from diseases caused by poisons applied in this way, as well as plants, animals, birds, fish, insects, and all kinds of other life forms that are even completely wiped out. All these present and future events and machinations, which have been occurring for a long time due to overpopulation, and which continue to occur today and in the future, I have already openly mentioned in the 1940s and 1950s, and sent in writing to many newspapers and radio stations all over the world, which, however, remained without any response and was also never published. And also today, since all my predictions are now coming true and being fulfilled, some of which I had already described in many different ways more than 70 years ago and also later, and I am still mentioning and spreading them today. Neither a newspaper nor a journal, television, or radio station cares about it, but on the contrary, I am only laughed at and insulted as a do-gooder, nutcase, lunatic, and sectarian, as I have always been. Neither honest and good journalists nor politicians, rulers, let alone the human beings from the populations want to hear the reality and its truth, but continue in the old rut of the slow but continuous, unstoppable and inevitable destruction and annihilation of all life of nature, its fauna and flora, as well as the atmosphere, the climate, the planet, and the entire environment, thoughtlessly and completely irresponsibly, and let the inevitable resulting catastrophe become reality. This is happening while the politicians and rulers as well as those otherwise responsible in the states are squandering taxpayers' money senselessly, to which the majority of the stupid people in the population are still shouting pro and hurrah. And so that also from this consequence, the upper elites of the state directing powerful do not have to starve and can live in joy and glory from the tax money of the working classes. They take care of this in a way by harassing, exploiting, and starving the populations with even more tax levies for all possible and impossible things. But everything is getting much worse, because according to forecasts and future probability calculations from the 1940s and 1950s, since 2011, the time has come for hundreds and thousands of abuses to be uncovered worldwide with regard to sexual abuse of children and young people, as well as the rape of nuns, mostly by Catholic clergy or priests, bishops, cardinals, and other dignitaries in the name of Christ. But these religious, sectarian, fallible sex abuse monsters of Christ's grace also include other evildoers from the business community and the general population, such as principals, group leaders or coaches or guides and leaders, etc., who, for example, treat, train, or teach individuals in many kinds of things, such as health promotion. For example, physiotherapy, psychology, psychiatry, etc. The same is also done with regard to the clergy, priests, bishops, cardinals, and other dignitaries in the name of Christ. The same is also done with regard to life support, schooling, all kinds of vocational schools, home help and also sports teams, language and music schools, etc. Both minors and adults are looked after, sexually abused and raped, forced into prostitution, tortured, enslaved, exploited, and finally mercilessly murdered. But all this is only a small part of the whole of all misery, all hardship and vehement violence, as well as all the manifold violent degenerations which henceforth spread ever more degenerately among earth humans, and also increase to unprecedented heights in criminal, terrorist, and warlike ways. Unpeace, lack of freedom, and injustice will become the order of the day, and the judicial authorities will become stooges of the deprivation of justice. And peacelessness, curtailment of freedom as well as strife, hatred, abuse, brawls, and vicious violence up to and including murder will become more and more rampant in families, friendships and acquaintances, in groupings and in human beings in general, as a result of the further uncontrolled overgrowth of the world's overpopulation and its ever more precarious machinations that are contemptuous of human beings and life. Families are increasingly terrorized by their own members, and family members, especially children and young people, are sexually abused and raped by their own family members, such as father, mother, and siblings or relatives, as well as murdered as a result of fear, jealousy, hatred, or for money or other material values. Human lack of relationships, mercilessness, disregard for fellow human beings, nature and its fauna and flora, and the general indifference associated with this and directed against everything, drives earthly humanity into a degeneracy beyond compare, and into a chaos of its own moral devaluation and depravity. And religious sectarian faith plays an exceptionally great and unsurpassed role in this, because it completely suppresses every spark of intellect, reason, and intelligence in the believing human being, and thereby prevents every independent recognition of effective real reality and its incontrovertible truth, as well as every independent thought with regard to the truth of reality, every consideration and creation of one's own reality, truth-based formation of opinion. The religious sectarian faith of the human being creates in him more and more confusion with regard to his faith-centered consciousness, intellect, reason, and justice, as well as his wrong moral and unrighteous attitude. Therefore all his senses in this respect fall into ever more vehemently flaring degenerations. These, however, give rise to ever-increasing fear, evil hatred, boundless peacelessness, unfreedom, jealousy, and uncontrollable violence, which spreads all around more and more. Spreads to fellow human beings and drags innumerable with it and leads to murder and manslaughter, to massacres and again, as since time immemorial, to renewed acts of war and terror. And all this can no longer be controlled, neither by the individual human beings themselves nor by the governments and their forces of order, etc. Consequently, from this side in every conceivable respect, with the unstoppable progress of electronic technical development, everything and anything, and consequently also the populations are spied on in every way and ultimately inevitably totally monitored. This is in addition to the fact that the ever-advancing development of fine electronic technology will unfold in such a way that the entire human race will become hopelessly dependent on it, and ultimately hopelessly dominated by it. Already today it is so far that innumerable earthlings are so addicted to the already highly developed electronic technology. Also, all corporations of all kinds, all governments, offices, armies, hospitals and service enterprises, etc., that already at the present time incalculable catastrophes occur if a failure of the existing technologies in this respect occurs even to a small extent. And if something like this happens on a larger scale, then there is hardly any rescue. And it is also the case that already today, in the case of certain catastrophes such as forest fires, despite the existing technology, not much can be done to save many people, as will be the case recently in California, as is the case again and again, where far more than 1,000 human beings will die. As you said the other day, even if it is assumed at first that there will only be a few deaths, and that so many human beings will die in the fire, as you said that there will be a catastrophe in several areas in California, with the forest fire raging and also the celebrity stronghold of Malibu being razed to the ground by the flames, as will also happen in Paradise and other areas, as your prediction apparatus has shown. That is solely the fault of overpopulation. Because as a result of the masses of human beings, more and more fertile land and healthy forests are being irresponsibly built up, as I also said myself. And if I look at the whole thing, it will get even worse in the future. Because the 100 million or so human beings who are populating the Earth more and more every year are creating much more disaster and destruction on the planet. Its nature and fauna and flora than they will ultimately be able to cope with, as a result of which a natural collapse will ultimately be inevitable. For California, on the one hand, the whole of this coming catastrophe will be one of historic proportions. For according to your words, everything in Malibu and Paradise will burn to the ground and also destroy everything far and wide. Whereby, however, only the overpopulation powers come into question as the originators, as you yourself have mentioned. I also wrote about these enormous fires in the USA in the 1940s and 1950s, when at that time the Earth's population was only 2 to 2.5 billion human beings, in contrast to today, when it is almost 9 billion, and that in only 70 years, as I said before. And the fact that Earth humans continue to grow at breakneck speed and through their machinations of all kinds, because they need more and more food and daily material, medical and other necessities, housing, means of transport, and many other things, create even more unsolvable problems, destroy even more, cause catastrophes, and destroy and exterminate plants and wildlife forms, so everything will only get worse. In addition, however, all those responsible in politics and governments, environmental organizations, know-it-alls, do-gooders, scientists and other loudmouths have no idea what really needs to be done. Namely, a worldwide rigorous birth stop for 7 years, and then a worldwide controlled birth control with a birth rate to be strictly adhered to. But instead of all the big-mouthed, the responsible people of the world, the politicians and rulers, in cooperation with their peoples, being intent on adopting and implementing these urgently needed measures, they are just lazing around with stupid palavering and behaving like immature children, engaging in childish, illogical babbling, because in their adolescence, on the one hand, they lack the intellect and reason to work out thoroughly thought-out, opportune solutions and measures. But since the majority of politicians, rulers, responsible organizations, religions and sects worldwide, as well as quite obviously the great majority of mankind, due to their manifold delusions of faith, only have enough intelligence to babble idle nonsense. Although they all boast of being humane, nature-friendly, life-affirming, and intelligent on the one hand, they are in reality incapable of perceiving the real reality and the truth visible in it. Consequently, it is absolutely impossible for them to have even a hint of a valuable thought about the authenticity, irrefutability of reality and its reliability, as well as the resulting truth and incontestable authenticity and security. Therefore, the majority of politicians and rulers worldwide, as well as the great majority of all peoples, who have become slaves to the majority of foolish, ignorant and incompetent politicians and rulers, as well as to the preachers of religions and sects, etc., are hopeless and cannot be expected to be helped by reason and rationality. Therefore, from these all, the necessary cannot be expected with regard to a birth stop and a birth regulation, as also not an end and stop of all destruction of nature, of the climate, as well as the destruction and extermination of fauna and flora. Consequently, it is also not possible for these two majorities to ever do what would be necessary to ensure that all life in nature and its fauna and flora can be preserved, which ultimately also includes human lives with a healthy population that is in line with the planet and nature, which in the current and further inexorably increasing mass will bring about the downfall of humanity, which can only be avoided if responsibility is finally seized with understanding, reason, and intelligence, and if correct and adequate action is necessarily taken.
And since you now openly state these facts, which effectively correspond to reality and truth, as you have also stated them as such, you will therefore be viciously attacked and condemned by all the fallible ones you have mentioned, because they all neither want to believe nor hear reality or truth, because they do not recognize themselves in their fallibility and self-importance, just as they do not feel attacked in their egoism and arrogance, nor do they want to recognize themselves as victims of their own degenerations. Only those Earth humans who are accessible to intellect and reason, and who are also not lacking in intelligence, will be on your side and join the mission and thus the truths of life. For those without intellect, reason and intelligence will keep away from the effective truth as they have done since time immemorial and remain addicted to their obedient religious, sectarian and false philosophical, as well as false and deceitful political and governmental populist faith. In this way, they testify to themselves as being addicted to stupidity, as being ignorant, as living in ignorance and in a lack of understanding and reason, as well as in a lack of intelligence.
There is no doubt about that for me, to which must be added, however, that these kinds of earthlings are absolute failures as human beings in their irrational behavior, as well as in their failure to heed and conceal predictions, and can only talk big.
Unreasonable behavior and the concealment of predictions from our peoples are absolutely alien to us, Ptaah, but I do not think I need to explain any more about that. On the other hand, I have something to say that I observe again and again in Earth humans and have to complain about. This is the excessive, superfluous, and voluminous speaking in terms of extravagant and pointless explanations and statements, as well as in terms of objections and misconduct, etc., concerning any things and facts, whereby the speakers do not perceive how they burden the audience with it and impair their interest as well as their attention. But because those who speak in this way are caught up in their desire to hear themselves and thus consciously or unconsciously elevate themselves above those who are being addressed and who feel annoyed by the torrent of speech, they very quickly lose their ability to listen and also to think. And this is also because their interest is destroyed by the torrent of speech presented by the speakers. These Earth humans who engage in such a torrent of speech are themselves so impressed by their own voice and by their almost endless talk that they are unable to control their torrent of speech, which is why they also make no effort to say, explain, object to, or correct what is necessary in only short words or in a short speech. In addition, there are various aspects that must also be mentioned, such as, for example, when rules, regulations, ordinances, laws and agreements, etc. exist, they must not simply be stubbornly enforced in a fixed manner, which is, however, very often attempted or done in this way, whereby, as a rule, this behavior inevitably results in, as you call it, paragraph-ridden behavior, to which no exception, change, or special position can or may be attributed. And in this way it results that the fulfillment of a paragraph, or several of them, the whole thing becomes an absolute, a must and thus a requirement. Consequently, even in special situations, neither necessary changes, omissions, innovations nor adaptations, etc. are taken into consideration. But attempts are made to vehemently and violently enforce the paragraph writing, that is to say, the paragraphs and the laws, regulations, orders, agreements and rules, etc. In this way, however, things, facts, events, and situations, which in their nature are in every case and exclusively always different and never identical in all nuances and also cannot be defined in the same way, are always judged and handled in the same way. This, however, is on the one hand fundamentally wrong, and on the other hand unjust in a way that testifies to the fact that human beings who orient their thoughts, feelings, actions, and behavior in this way are absolutely incapable of making righteous judgments and determinations in such matters and things. Therefore, human beings who think and act in this way, which is already brought up in many forms by the persons concerned in a wrong way through early life circumstances, must make due efforts to free themselves again from their wrong judgments and wrong actions, and turn to the logic or consistency of sensible and just judgments, decisions, actions, and behavior. This, however, is difficult for Earth humans because they first have to admit their wrong behavior, which as a rule goes against their sense according to their misunderstood conception of self-righteousness. as a result of which they feel affected by self-pity and imprudence and, impaired by reason, behave in a rejecting manner, clinging to the old patterns, which they do not want to give up because they are riding on the coattails and, in accordance with their understanding and reason, neither want to change them by innovations nor lead them to the better. So also no necessary changes are considered, but the old ways are stubbornly adhered to, and any progress towards the better and good in the future is prevented, to which also thoughtless, unfair aspects are cited. That equal law applies to all, and thus it must be ensured that no necessary exceptions are made, but all must be equally categorized into the same duties, rights, and orders. This, however, is fundamentally wrong, unworthy of human beings, unjust, and, moreover, destructive, namely in every family and community, as well as in every grouping, in every nation, which is why everything must always be handled and judged as well as determined according to a given situation and matter. Consequently, everything may never be judged, decided, and handled equally in all situations, and circumstances as well as in one matter and another. Every situation, thing and circumstance requires separate decisions, actions and behavior, etc. Just as, for example, every criminal who has committed exactly the same offense as another must also be judged, punished and dealt with according to the latter's personal circumstances, his conduct in committing the offense, his distress, and various other factors. If this is considered in detail, then it also results in the realization that completely different and relevant orders, fulfillments of duty and behavior must be considered and applied if any things, situations or events arise that require exceptions in a fixed order or some other necessary change, such as, for example, in the case of unavoidably necessary punishment. For example, in the case of unavoidable fulfillment of work obligations which arise and must be carried out for reasons of personal or community safety, or which concern the daily needs of life in relation to all necessities arising, such as food, housing, insurance and transport, etc. On the other hand, there are also inevitabilities which must inevitably be regulated by changes or exceptions and which must never be subject to refusal, such as illness or accident, as well as mothers in childbirth or with infants already in life who still require direct maternal care. Consequently, necessary exceptions and changes must be considered and granted, even when certain rules have been decided upon and given. In any case, a rule that has been decided upon never means coercion, nor violence, and above all, never the application of a lawlessness, whereby such a lawlessness has been from time immemorial the worst means of destroying peace, freedom, and justice, and it also continues to be so and must never be applied. Of course, in every human community there must be orders, laws and decrees as well as ordinances, thus also rules, but all these must never be absolutely unchangeable, but must always be adaptable to every conceivable possible situation and thing, etc. Consequently, action must never be taken only exactly according to a decided paragraph, but everyone must be variable according to situation and thing. A rule, moreover, is not an absolutely fixed order, but a factor of a general, special, yet simple guideline, not difficult, not absolutely fixed, not to be strictly observed, which without exception embodies only as a practiced custom what is usual and what is usually valid, but which admits of exceptions. A rule is not a law, for such a law corresponds to an unalterable right of every society, or the law of society itself, so the law is, according to the law itself. Consequently, also by virtue of the law, the administration of justice is exercised unalterably, whereby, however, rules are introduced which, depending on the case, judge an equal and identical thing according to its circumstances, or according to given particular facts. This is in contrast to the rule, which is derived from certain temporally conditioned and changeable regularities, which are gained from experience and knowledge, and which are temporally fixed in agreement with the parties involved and for a certain area as a binding guideline with the possibility of necessary exceptions and changes. In this respect, too, as everywhere else, it is not advisable to be a bureaucrat, but rather to create discord, lack of freedom, and injustice, and thus to destroy them. If, in the process, objections are included and polemics are raised and endless and pointless self-indulgent rants are made, then everything quickly leads to disinterest on the part of the audience. Because every polemic and every rant is usually understood as an attack and is therefore rejected, just as hostility and rejection arise from it. Human beings who demand the strict and unalterable observance and fulfillment of paragraphs, rules, order, law or behavior or anything else, whereby they make, conduct, and present a speech, objections, demands, regulations, or a statement, etc., in a voluble or polemicizing and dominating manner, suffer from a pathological obsession. Such an obsession dictates to them, against reason and rationality, that in every case there must be compliance with paragraphs without any pardon and without any possibility of a necessary change. In this way, blatant domination also comes to the fore, although the human beings concerned, who are afflicted by these degenerations, do not perceive this in any way. Nor does such a human being recognize his obsession or his dominance, and thus also the fact, because he is not aware of his selfish misbehavior, that his torrent of words annoys those who have to listen in such a way, as I have already explained before, that they lose their interest and attention in the matter to be discussed or simply recited, do not really listen and even misunderstand everything, and consequently also misinterpret it, as scribes then also wrongly record in their annals. The whole thing, however, also leads to the fact that a single person's rants animate and seduce the audience so that statements and speeches of other persons, who present their statements, explanations and speeches, etc., in a reasonably short framework with words. Speeches, explanations, and explanations are also perceived as annoying, and therefore their statements are also not comprehensively grasped, but only halfway understood and misinterpreted. In this context, there is also the inevitable factor that, as a result of the harassing torrent of words or the polemicizing, etc., of a human being who talks in an unobjective, unnecessary and meaningless, endless manner, the listeners not only feel very harassed and become inattentive, but also become incapable of remembering and thus retaining the contents of their torrents of words and polemicizing in their memory as a result of the molesting note Billy, harassing. This inevitably results in the fact that, once decided and fixed, rants and polemics by speakers, etc., cause a profound lack of attention and annoyance among the audience, whereby the memory of the whole thing is wiped out before it can settle in the memory as reminiscence, and thus as memory performance or memorability. And this in turn leads to the fact that when reference is made to certain resolutions, occurrences, happenings and situations, etc., that were taken, decided, and determined, etc., there is no recollection of them, and it is not infrequently claimed that such things never took place, etc.
What you say is all clear to me, but not to the human beings of this world. Consequently, many of those who have to bear responsibility in these directions you mention are in no way aware that they are behaving completely wrongly and even against the natural creational laws. And they do this because they have yet to learn everything in relation to the whole of this, which, however, on the one hand is extremely arduous for them, but on the other hand must also first be taught to them, because they have as yet no or only extremely little knowledge of what corresponds to correctness and what corresponds to falsity in relation to the facts you have mentioned.
This is correct, but no excuse. For intellect, reason, and intelligentsia are, in all those earth humans who are not in any way handicapped in their consciousness, but are normal, as you are wont to say, through intellect, reason, and intelligentsia themselves responsible in every respect for everything and anything of their thoughts, feelings, actions, and behavior. And this is also so even if they have no knowledge of anything, facts, etc., for responsibility already begins where ideas and thoughts arise. For these, once they have arisen, lead to further reflection and thus also to the perception of reality and truth in free nature, the whole environment of mankind and all living beings of every species and kind, from which, with sufficient and thoughtful reflection and reasoning, etc., the natural creational laws can be recognized and the correct knowledge and conclusions drawn from them brought to bear and comprehended in life through understanding, reason, action, and conduct.
Of course, that is clear and cannot be refuted. But the whole thing requires a long course of teaching which we cannot simply work through in our conversation. So I think we will leave this subject now. So I want to point out that in a private conversation the other day it was said that the U.S. presidential oaf Trump is not simply stupid, but pathologically stupid, and also does not realize how he is being badly influenced and misadvised in many ways by his false advisors and other people surrounding him, advisors and vassals. This is especially the case with regard to Russia, he said, because in this regard Trump is being unipolarly and inflammatorily influenced against Russia by his anti-Russia advisors surrounding him, which he does not realize in his stupidity.
That is correct, because Trump is being influenced all around, both with regard to Russia but also equally with regard to China and other states of the world, in such a way that the USA is the only state capable of unipolar leadership. In his stupidity and arrogance, Trump is getting more and more out of hand, attacking everything and anything of other countries that he does not like, disrupting and destroying established contractual orders and agreements through false accusations and, moreover, dissolving important treaties in order to enforce his America First, according to his confused sense. In this action, he is also mistakenly hoping and believing that he will be thanked by the entire American people. This, however, is not the case, for in spite of his clueless followers, there are also many clear-thinking and reasonable people who oppose his and his false advisors and vassals' unreasonable and hateful machinations of hostility against Russia, war, contempt for humanity, hegemony, and disorder. It will come, however, that ill-advised and irrational Trump delusionists will also viciously resort to dangerous acts of violence and underhanded attacks on his behalf to infamously and insidiously target persons who disagree with Trump's machinations, object to his confused actions, and are consequently to be eliminated. So persons are to be brought to harm who publicly intervene against Trump's dishonest and all-round hostility-provoking machinations. The fact is, with regard to Trump's pathological stupidity, that in his paranoid state, respectively in his condition of unreason and irrationality, he also exhibits a great degree of negative brain organic changes, which is why he not only organizes confused trampling all over the world, but also sets up, arranges, and stages vicious intrigues in order to be able to realize his America First delusional plans. However, neither Trump nor any of his misleading advisors and all those who negatively influence and support him in his delusion of hegemony are able to grasp that he is also endangering the security of the USA and the states, of Asia and Europe, and ultimately heating up the dangerously wavering and dubious calm of the entire world more and more, which could suddenly explode unexpectedly and lead to a nuclear war. All the advisors and other vassals who go along with his crazy ideas and who are sick in the same delusion are not able to judge what they are conjuring up, let alone understand what disaster encompassing the world and humanity can result from their delusional thinking and delusional actions. All the misguided anti-peace activists in the government circles and among the like-minded people in the United States of America do not care about the fact that the delusion of ignorant hostility towards Russia in the U.S. government, as well as in that part of the U.S. population, is counteracting all peace efforts, which Russia has been striving for since time immemorial, and which the Russian people, and especially President Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, are also striving for today. This, while, on the contrary, the sensible and reasonable minority of the U.S. population, who want peace, freedom, and justice, as well as a conciliatory and sociable relationship with Russia, and who are willing to make peaceful concessions, are being harassed and called traitors. But the majority of the U.S. government and the U.S. military, as well as the U.S. intelligence services, above all the CIA, but also the uninformed part of the Russia-hostile U.S. population, do not care about this. And this not caring also refers to the fact that, as a result, Russia is forced to enter into relations with China, Syria, Turkey, and Persia, etc. on its own. Instead of this being achieved in cooperation with the USA and also involving all the other states of the world, a start could be made towards world peace. This, however, will fail, as it always has, due to the hegemony mania of the USA, from which the consequence will arise that China and Japan, despite the old enmity from wartime, will also strive among themselves again for rapprochement and peace and, under certain circumstances, will ultimately form a unity against the hegemonic ambitions of the USA and defend themselves against them. But the power-obsessed and Russia-hostile state powers of the USA, currently at the forefront the pathologically stupid Trump, his false advisors and all the elite vassals cheering him on, as well as also the ignorant Russia-hostile part of the U.S. population, are neither interested in peace, freedom, nor justice in the world, but on the contrary only in their might and their increasing wealth from many sources from which they can enrich themselves. But also their cowardly fear of Russia pushes the U.S. state powers to incite the U.S. American people and the states of the earth against Russia, which is why they accuse Russia and its President Putin of dishonesty via their stupid President Donald Trump, who is in bondage to them and also foolishly and nonsensically increases his own hostility towards Russia. But Trump, in his pathological stupidity, in his self-importance and his megalomania, does not perceive how the malicious suggestive influence affects him, nor can he recognize and understand that by broadcasting his own and his anti-Russia advisors' and vassals' agitation against Russia and other states to the world, he is endangering the peace and the continued existence of the world and its humanity, which is only hanging by a loose thread. And the fact that in doing so, he is also denouncing existing treaties and accusing other states, which at least maintain a cold peace in the world, of breaches of treaties and other dishonest machinations, etc. He is also unable to grasp, as well as the fact that in his stupidity he is personally directing untenable allegations of lies and slander against Russia. He also does this against other states, and by accusing them of dishonesty that has no truth content, he also creates enmities that are directed against the USA. Moreover, he also acts in this way by suggestively fueling claims by his false advisors and vassals around him, whereby he is about to conjure up a new arms buildup and arms race, with nuclear weapons also being included in these vicious plans.
If I understand correctly, you meant by the term unipolar that Trump, through his false advisors and other vassals and other anti-Russia people who crowd around him, is, so to speak, unilaterally, single-tracked or single-poled in a negative and malicious way against Russia and hatefully influenced in the wrong way. But according to what you say about Donald Trump, I would also like to say something about him, namely that he is probably the stupidest and most simple-minded president the USA has ever had. Moreover, I see his whole demeanor, speeches, and behavior in a way that reminds me, only in a slightly different way, of the torrents of speeches that were spread by Adolf Hitler, the Führer or NSDAP dictator in Germany, as well as by the endless agitator and propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, and by Heinrich Himmler, who saw himself as a Teuton over the radio, which I had already listened to frequently as a boy during the Third and Last World War from 1939 to 1945.
What you say with regard to unipolar is correct, because the USA are all those politicians, military and secret services, etc., as well as the anti-Russia part of the fellow travelers from the people who believe all the lying propaganda of the anti-Russia government elite. Want a hegemonistic and therefore unipolar world order, whereby the USA as the sole state should first and foremost dominate and rule Russia and subsequently all other states. And when you compare Trump's speeches, behavior, and conduct with the rantings of the top NSDAP leaders of the Hitler regime, then I too can see certain similarities in this respect.